The late afternoon sun filtered through the lace curtains of the community center in Charlotte, North Carolina, casting a warm golden glow across the modest celebration hall. Balloons in shades of lavender and cream, Grandma Ruby's favorite colors, bobbed gently from their ribbon anchors, while the scent of homemade sweet potato pie and fried chicken filled the air. The sound of laughter mixed with the soft hum of conversation as 3 generations of the Curry family gathered around folding tables, covered with checkered tablecloths. Ruby Mae Curry sat in her place of honor, a wooden chair decorated with a handmade banner reading, "Happy 90th Birthday, Grandma Ruby." Her weathered hands, marked by decades of hard work and gentle care, rested on her lap as she watched her great-grandchildren chase each other between the tables. Despite her age, her eyes still sparkled with the same mischievous glint that had captivated her late husband over 70 years ago. "Mama Ruby, you sure you don't want to rest a bit?" asked her daughter-in-law, Sonia Curry, as she adjusted the shawl around the elderly woman's shoulders. The North Carolina evening was beginning to cool, and the old building's heating system had seen better days. "Child, I've been resting for 90 years, Ruby chuckled, her voice carrying the melodic cadence of the South. "Today, I want to see every face, hear every story, and feel every hug. These moments don't come back." Around the room, cousins who hadn't seen each other in months caught up over paper plates piled high with soul food. Ruby's son, Del Curry, stood near the makeshift DJ station, sharing stories with his nephews about his NBA days, though everyone knew the real pride in his voice came from talking about his sons. The conversation inevitably turned to Stephen and Seth, both making their mark in professional basketball, following in their father's footsteps. "Where are those boys anyway?" asked Ruby's sister, Aunt May, squinting toward the door as if willing them to appear. "Seth said he'd be here by 6, and you know Stephen's always fashionably late to family gatherings." Del glanced at his watch, a slight frown creasing his brow. Seth texted earlier. His flight from Portland was delayed. As for Stephen, he shrugged with the resigned acceptance of a father who'd learned to expect the unexpected from his superstar son's schedule. "You know how it is with his commitments." But Ruby wasn't concerned. She'd raised enough children and grandchildren to know that love didn't always arrive on time, but it always arrived when it mattered most. She watched her great-granddaughter, barely 3 years old, attempt to climb onto a chair twice her size, and smiled at the determination in the child's face, a trait that clearly ran in the family. The room grew warmer as more relatives filtered in, each bringing their own dish and their own memories. Cousin Jerome arrived with his famous cornbread, while Ruby's niece brought enough collard greens to feed a small army. The community center, which had hosted countless family celebrations over the years, seemed to expand with the love filling its walls. As the evening progressed, Ruby found herself drifting between conversations and quiet moments of reflection. This building held so many memories: church gatherings, wedding receptions, graduation parties. She remembered bringing Del here as a young boy for community basketball games, never imagining that one day her grandsons would be household names in the sport. "Grandma, tell us about the old days again," called out Marcus, one of her teenage great-grandsons, as several of the younger family members gathered around her chair. Their faces looked up at her with genuine curiosity, hungry for the stories that connected them to their roots. Ruby's eyes took on a distant quality as she began to speak about growing up in rural North Carolina during the 1930s, about making do with less, about the values that kept families together through tough times. Her voice painted pictures of a simpler era, walking miles to school, helping her mother tend to the vegetable garden, and learning that hard work and faith could overcome almost any obstacle. "The most important thing," she said, her voice growing stronger with conviction, "is to never forget where you come from. Success can change a lot of things, but it should never change your heart or your respect for the people who helped shape you." As she spoke, neither she nor anyone else in the room noticed the figure standing quietly in the doorway, listening to every word with tears already forming in his eyes. The conversation in the community center had settled into the comfortable rhythm of family storytelling when a small commotion near the entrance caused several heads to turn. A man with a familiar silhouette stood in the doorway, his Golden State Warriors cap pulled low, but not low enough to hide the unmistakable features that graced magazine covers and television screens across the nation. "Oh, my lord," whispered Aunt May, her hand flying to her chest. "Is that Stephen?" Dell's voice boomed across the room, a mixture of surprise and fatherly pride evident in his tone. The room fell silent for a heartbeat before erupting into excited murmurs and the scraping of chairs as family members turned to get a better look. Stephen Curry stood there for a moment, taking in the scene. The modest decorations, the familiar faces, the scent of his childhood comfort foods, and felt his throat tighten with emotion. Ruby, whose hearing had dimmed with age, but whose instincts remained sharp, turned slowly in her chair. When her eyes met those of her grandson, time seemed to suspend itself. The superstar athlete, the man who had broken countless records and earned millions of dollars, suddenly looked like the 8-year-old boy who used to spend summers at her kitchen table, learning life lessons over bowls of homemade ice cream. "Baby boy," Ruby whispered, her voice barely audible above the family's excited chatter. Stephen moved through the room like a man in a dream, accepting quick hugs and handshakes from relatives, but his focus remained laser-locked on the small woman in the decorated chair. When he finally reached her, he dropped to one knee beside her seat, taking her weathered hands in his own. "Happy birthday, Grandma Ruby," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I wouldn't miss this for the world." The tears that had been threatening since he'd arrived finally spilled over as Ruby cupped his face in her hands, studying the features that had matured since their last visit, but still held traces of the boy she remembered. "You came," she said simply, as if his presence was both a surprise and an inevitability. "Of course I came," Stephen replied, covering her hands with his own. "You think I'd miss your 90th birthday? The woman who taught me everything I know about being a man?" The room had grown quiet again, family members instinctively understanding that they were witnessing something sacred. Children who had been running around moments before now stood still, sensing the gravity of the moment, even if they couldn't fully comprehend it. Sonia approached with her phone, but Stephen gently shook his head. This moment wasn't for social media or public consumption. This was family, pure and simple. "How's my shooting?" Stephen asked with a playful grin, referencing the countless hours Ruby had spent in her backyard, watching him practice on the rusty hoop attached to her old oak tree. "Still needs work," Ruby replied without missing a beat, causing the room to erupt in laughter and breaking some of the emotional tension. "But your heart's gotten stronger, and that's what matters most." As the evening continued, Stephen settled into the family rhythm as if he'd never left. He helped serve food, caught up with cousins he hadn't seen in months, and played with the children who were simultaneously awed by his fame and comfortable with his presence as simply Cousin Stephen. But those who knew him best, Dell, Sonia, and especially Ruby, could sense something different about him tonight. There was a weight to his presence, a purposefulness that went beyond simply showing up for a family celebration. He kept glancing at Ruby with an expression that mixed love, gratitude, and something that looked almost like nervous anticipation. As the formal dinner wound down and family members began sharing birthday toasts and memories, Stephen stood near the back of the room, his hands clasped behind his back. His father caught his eye and raised an eyebrow in silent question, but Stephen just nodded toward Ruby, indicating that whatever he had planned, it would happen in due time. The younger children had been corralled into a corner where they were working on a puzzle, their voices creating a gentle backdrop to the adult conversations. The older teenagers had formed their own group near the refreshment table, stealing glances at their famous relative and whispering among themselves. Ruby, meanwhile, held court from her chair, accepting well wishes and sharing memories with a steady stream of family members. But even in her moments of greatest joy, her eyes would find Stephen across the room, and something in her expression suggested she knew her grandson had more on his mind than simple birthday wishes. As the evening deepened and the celebration began to take on the mellow quality of a family gathering well enjoyed, Stephen finally moved toward the front of the room. He didn't make any grand gestures or call for attention, but somehow the family sensed his intention, and conversations gradually quieted. "Grandma Ruby," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent room, "I hope you don't mind, but I have something I need to say." Stephen stood at the front of the community center, surrounded by 3 generations of his family, but his attention focused entirely on the small woman in the birthday chair. The room had fallen completely silent, even the youngest children sensing that something important was about to happen. Outside, the North Carolina evening had settled into darkness, making the warm light inside seem even more intimate and precious. "Grandma Ruby," Stephen began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "I've stood in front of thousands of people, given interviews to millions more, but I've never been more nervous than I am right now." A few family members chuckled softly, but Ruby just watched her grandson with patient, loving eyes, the same way she'd watched him struggle through difficult math homework at her kitchen table decades earlier. "When I was 8 years old," Stephen continued, "I spent that summer with you while Mom and Dad worked out some things with his coaching job. You remember that summer, don't you?" Ruby nodded slowly, her mind traveling back to that pivotal time when her grandson had been grappling with his parents' temporary separation and the uncertainty that came with his father's career transitions. "Every morning you'd make me breakfast, scrambled eggs, toast cut into triangles, and orange juice in that plastic cup with the cartoon characters. And every morning you'd ask me the same question: what kind of man do you want to be when you grow up?" The room remained absolutely still, everyone hanging on Stephen's words. Dell and Sonia exchanged glances, remembering that difficult summer, and how Ruby had provided stability when their family needed it most. "I gave you different answers every day," Stephen said, a small smile playing at his lips. "A basketball player, a doctor, a teacher, a firefighter. But you never seemed satisfied with any of those answers. You'd just nod and say, 'That's what you want to do, baby.' I asked what kind of man you want to be." Ruby's eyes glistened with unshed tears as the memory crystallized. She remembered that confused little boy, trying to make sense of a world that seemed uncertain, seeking answers from the one person who always seemed to have them. "Then one morning after I'd been with you for about 6 weeks, something clicked. I looked at you across that old Formica table and said, 'I want to be the kind of man who never forgets the people who loved him when he had nothing to offer in return.'" A few family members gasped softly, beginning to understand where this story was leading. Stephen's voice grew stronger as he continued. "You smiled, the biggest smile I'd ever seen, and you said, 'Now that's an answer worth living up to.' Then you made me promise something. You made me promise that no matter how high I climbed, no matter how far I traveled, I would always remember that love given freely is the most valuable thing in the world." Stephen paused, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out a small worn envelope, yellowed with age. "You gave me this letter that same morning, and told me not to open it until I felt like I'd become the man we talked about. You said I'd know when that time came." The envelope trembled slightly in Stephen's hands as he held it up for everyone to see. Ruby's breath caught in her throat. She had almost forgotten about that letter, written in a moment of inspiration by a grandmother who wanted to plant seeds of character in her grandson's heart. "I've carried this letter with me for 25 years, Stephen said, his voice breaking slightly. "Through high school championships, through college struggles, through getting drafted, through winning NBA championships, I kept waiting for the right moment, kept wondering if I was worthy of whatever wisdom you'd written inside." He looked directly at Ruby, his eyes shining with tears. "But tonight, sitting here with all of you, listening to you talk about never forgetting where you come from, I realized something. I've been looking at this all wrong. It wasn't about becoming worthy of your words. It was about understanding that your love made me worthy from the very beginning." With careful hands, Stephen opened the envelope that had waited patiently for over 2 decades. Inside was a single sheet of paper, written in Ruby's careful cursive handwriting. His hands shook as he unfolded it, and when he began to read aloud, his voice was barely above a whisper. "My dear Stephen," he read. If you're reading this, it means you've grown into the man I always knew you could be. Not because of what you've accomplished, but because you remembered the promise you made to a grandmother who loves you more than words can say. The world will try to tell you that success is measured in trophies, and money, and fame. But I'm writing to tell you something different. Success is measured in the lives you touch, the love you give, and the way you honor the people who helped you become who you are. The room was completely silent now, even the youngest children sensing the sacredness of the moment. Several family members were openly crying. Stephen's voice grew stronger as he continued reading. I have a feeling that when you read this, you'll want to do something grand for your old grandmother. But here's what I really want. I want you to remember that the love in this room, the love of family, is worth more than anything the world can offer. And I want you to promise me that you'll use whatever platform life gives you to remind other people of the same thing. He looked up from the letter, tears streaming down his face. There's more, he said, but the rest is between you and me, Grandma. What I can share is this. You ended the letter by saying that your greatest gift to me wasn't any specific lesson or piece of advice. Your greatest gift was showing me what unconditional love looks like. Stephen carefully folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope, then walked over to Ruby and knelt beside her chair once more. So here's my promise to you on your 90th birthday, in front of everyone who matters most to us. I promise to spend the rest of my life trying to love others the way you loved me, freely, completely, and without condition. But Stephen wasn't finished. He reached into his other pocket and pulled out a thick folder of papers. And because I know you're going to ask me to put my money where my mouth is, he said with a watery smile, I want you to know about something I've been working on for the past 3 years. The family leaned forward, sensing that the biggest surprise was yet to come. Stephen held the folder in his hands, looking around the room at the faces of his family, faces that reflected generations of love, struggle, sacrifice, and triumph. The weight of the moment settled on his shoulders, but it was a good weight, the kind that comes from carrying something precious and meaningful. 3 years ago, Stephen began, his voice steadier now but still thick with emotion, I started thinking about legacy. Not the kind of legacy that gets talked about on sports shows or written in record books, but real legacy, the kind that changes lives and honors the people who made us who we are. He opened the folder and pulled out the first document, his hands steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to reveal. Ruby watched him with curious, patient eyes, the same expression she'd worn when he was a child working through a difficult problem. Grandma Ruby, you spent your entire life giving to others. You raised 7 children of your own, helped raise I don't know how many grandchildren, and opened your home to anyone who needed a place to belong. You worked double shifts at the textile mill to make sure your kids had school clothes, and you still found time to teach Sunday school every week. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Everyone present had benefited from Ruby's generosity in some way, whether through her cooking, her wisdom, her prayers, or simply her presence. During difficult times, you never asked for anything in return, Stephen continued. Never complained, never made anyone feel like they owed you. But tonight I want to tell you about something I've been planning. A way to make sure your legacy of love and giving continues long after all of us are gone. He held up the first document. This is the charter for the Ruby May Curry Foundation for Family and Community Development. It's been fully funded and will operate in perpetuity. Gasps echoed through the room. Dell stood up straighter, his eyes wide with surprise and pride. Sonia covered her mouth with her hands, tears streaming down her cheeks. Stephen's voice grew stronger as he explained. The foundation will focus on 3 main areas, all inspired by the lessons you taught me. First, it will provide support for grandparents who are raising their grandchildren, help with housing, education costs, and childcare. Because you showed me that sometimes the most important parents are the ones who step up when biology isn't enough. Ruby's hands trembled as she reached out to touch the document, her eyes scanning the official letterhead and seal. Her own name, printed in elegant script, seemed to shimmer in the community center's fluorescent lighting. Second, Stephen continued, pulling out another set of papers. The foundation will fund community centers like this one all across North Carolina and beyond. Places where families can gather, where kids can be safe after school, where neighbors can become extended family. Because you taught me that community isn't just about the people who share your blood, it's about the people who share your heart. Several family members were crying openly now, overwhelmed by the scope and thoughtfulness of Stephen's gesture. Young Marcus, the teenager who had asked for stories earlier, stared at his famous cousin with new understanding of what true success looked like. And third, Stephen said, his voice beginning to break again, the foundation will establish scholarships, not just for academic achievement or athletic ability, but for young people who demonstrate the kind of character you tried to instill in all of us. Kids who help their neighbors, who stand up for others, who understand that real strength comes from lifting people up, not tearing them down. He knelt beside Ruby's chair once more, placing the folder in her lap. But here's the part that I hope will make you the proudest. Every single program, every scholarship, every community center will be required to have one specific component: a space for storytelling, where older community members can share their wisdom with younger generations. Because you taught me that the most important lessons aren't found in textbooks. They're found in the stories of people who've lived through challenges and emerged with their hearts intact. Ruby stared down at the papers in her lap, her weathered fingers tracing the foundation's logo, a simple oak tree with deep roots and spreading branches. When she finally looked up at Stephen, her eyes held a mixture of overwhelming gratitude and profound understanding. "Baby boy," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of 9 decades of living. "You didn't need to do all this." Stephen took her hands in his, the same way he had when he first arrived that evening. "Yes, I did, Grandma, because you taught me that love isn't just a feeling. It's an action. And this is my way of putting action behind everything you taught me." The room erupted in applause, but Ruby held up one shaking hand, indicating she had something to say. The applause died down, and everyone leaned forward to hear her words. "In all my 90 years," Ruby said, her voice clear and strong despite her age, "I have been blessed beyond measure. I've seen children grow into good parents, grandchildren become leaders, and great-grandchildren who give me hope for the future. But this," she gestured to the folder in her lap, then looked around the room at all the faces watching her. "This isn't just about money or buildings or programs. This is about understanding that the love we give to each other is the only thing that really lasts." She turned her attention back to Stephen, her eyes fierce with pride and love. "You want to know what makes me proudest? It's not that you became famous or successful. It's that you became the kind of man who remembers a promise made to his grandmother. It's that you understand that true greatness is measured by how much good you can do for others." Ruby struggled to stand, and immediately several family members moved to help her. Once she was on her feet, she placed her hands on Stephen's shoulders and looked directly into his eyes. "You kept your promise, baby boy. You became the kind of man who never forgets where he came from. And now you're making sure that other people never forget either." As the evening wound down, and family members began the reluctant process of saying goodbye, the community center seemed to hold the echoes of something transformative. Children who had been running around hours earlier now sat quietly with grandparents, asking for more stories. Teenagers who usually lived on their phones were engaged in real conversations with their elders. Adults who had been caught up in the day-to-day grind of life were reminded of what truly mattered. Stephen spent his final hour at the party not talking about basketball or celebrity life, but sitting in a circle with his youngest relatives, listening as Ruby told stories about their family history. He watched her face as she spoke, memorizing every expression, every gesture, knowing that moments like these were more valuable than any trophy or contract. As the family began to pack up leftover food and take down decorations, Stephen helped Ruby to the car that would take her back to her assisted living facility. Before she got in, she turned to him one last time. "The letter," she said quietly, referring to the 25-year-old message he had finally opened. "Did you read the last part?" Stephen nodded, pulling the worn envelope from his pocket. "You said that love given freely always comes back multiplied." Ruby smiled, the same brilliant smile that had lit up her face when an 8-year-old boy had finally understood what kind of man he wanted to become. "Look around you, baby boy. Look at this family. Look at what you're going to do with that foundation. Look at all the lives that are going to be changed because one grandmother loved one little boy unconditionally. That's love multiplied." As Ruby's car pulled away from the community center, Stephen stood in the parking lot surrounded by his family, watching the taillights disappear into the North Carolina night. The foundation documents were safely tucked under Dell's arm, ready to begin the work of turning love into action, of ensuring that Ruby's legacy would touch lives for generations to come. Celebration was over, but the real work, the work of living up to the promises made to a woman who had given her whole life to loving others, was just beginning. And as Stephen looked up at the stars visible above the small town where his roots ran deep, he knew that some promises were worth waiting 25 years to fulfill, and some love was worth spending a lifetime trying to repay. In the quiet of the evening, with the warmth of family still surrounding him, Stephen Curry understood that he had finally become the man his grandmother always knew he could be, not because of what he had achieved, but because of what he had chosen to give back. The 8-year-old boy who had sat at Ruby's kitchen table, struggling to define what kind of man he wanted to become, had found his answer not in fame or fortune, but in the simple act of honoring the woman who had loved him first and best. The Ruby May Curry Foundation would go on to change thousands of lives, but its most important work had already been accomplished. It had reminded a family, and eventually the world, that the greatest success comes not from what we achieve for ourselves, but from what we do for others. And it had shown that sometimes the most powerful promises are the ones we make to the people who love us, not for what we might become, but for who we already are. As the last car pulled out of the community center parking lot, the building stood quiet and dark, but somehow still warm with the echoes of love given, received, and multiplied beyond measure. In a few days, news of Stephen's foundation would reach the media, inspiring others to think about their own legacies and the people who had shaped them. But tonight it remained what it had always been intended to be: a family story, a love story, and a testament to the enduring power of promises kept and love freely given. The boy who had learned about character at his grandmother's kitchen table had grown into a man who understood that the most important victories happen not on basketball courts, but in the quiet moments when we choose to honor the people who made us who we are. And in a small community center in Charlotte, North Carolina, surrounded by the people who knew him best, Stephen Curry had just won the most important game of his life.